Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into another fascinating life?
Always.
This time, we're taking a closer look at Polly Adler.
Now she's a name that raises eyebrows.
To say the least, a notorious madam running a, well, thriving business, let's call it, in New York City, the 1920s through the 40s. We're basing this deep dive on a Wikipedia article about her. And trust me, it gets pretty interesting.
Oh, more than interesting, I'd say. Her story really digs into a whole era, a whole social structure.
Absolutely, because we're not just talking about the scandalous side of things. We're looking at how she built a whole empire, especially at a time when women, let alone immigrant women, face so many roadblocks.
It's a story of ambition, definitely survival, set against, well, all the huge social changes happening in America back then. Think about it, the early 20th century, you've got industrialization booming, immigrants pouring in.
A whole new world forming, really.
Exactly. And you can picture Polly arriving from Belarus, just 13 years old, limited resources, barely speaking the language.
It's hard to even imagine facing those challenges. And then, on top of that, the source mentions this traumatic experience she had early on. Working at a corset factory, she was assaulted, ended up pregnant.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking. And think about it. Back then, the support system, the understanding around these things, practically non-existent. Single motherhood, abortion, huge stigma.
So limited options for someone in her position.
Exactly. And while, of course, we can't condone every choice she made, you really have to see her actions through the lens of those limited options.
It's like judging a chess game from the 1920s by today's rules, right? The board's the same, but the moves you're allowed to make, totally different.
Perfect analogy.
So we got Polly navigating this whole turbulent world. She lands in Manhattan, the energy, the opportunity, but also, well, the vice. And that's where she meets Nicholas Montana. This guy's, well, he's involved in connecting women with wealthy clients. Let's put it that way.
And that encounter, that's a turning point, really sets her on a certain path. But it's important to note, she didn't just fall into this and give up. The source mentions her trying other things, like running a lingerie shop.
Right. So it makes her eventual choice even more striking. She decides to really dive into this world, not just survive, but conquer it. And that's where her business sense, you see it shine. Luxurious houses she sets up. The majestic tower decked out in, well, opulent isn't even the word. There's a bar designed like King Tut's tomb.
Talk about knowing your target audience.
Yeah.
This was a calculated move miles away from that stereotypical image of a dingy brothel.
Right. Creating an experience, a brand almost.
Exactly. And reportedly, the women working for her, well-treated, highly sought after, she catered to New York's elite.
Almost like she was using modern marketing before anyone even came up with the term, building relationships with journalists, making sure people were talking about her places in all the right circles, and of course, managing things with the authorities to keep the whole operation running.
A whole web of, well, social maneuvering and economic savvy.
Definitely. And speaking of maneuvering, this is where it gets really juicy.
Yeah.
The client list. We're talking names like Peter Arno, the famous cartoonist, George S. Kosman, the playwright, even Dorothy Parker, the writer, the wit.
And those are just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. You've got Jimmy Walker, the mayor himself. Makes you think, what did it say about those times that she could attract such a powerful, diverse group? Were they looking for a discreet escape from public life? Or maybe indulging in some forbidden fun during Prohibition?
Prohibition. Can't forget about that. A whole underground economy popping up around illegal alcohol, speakeasies, and, well, other businesses, too.
So did Polly capitalize on that atmosphere? Was her success tied to those underground economies merging?
It's a fascinating idea. She was right at the crossroads of, well, wealth, desire, and that thrill of breaking the rules. It's crucial to see her within that whole context. It's not just about sex work. It's about understanding the social forces, the legal loopholes, how things were changing in America.
And, as her business takes off, she can't fly under the radar forever. That's where the scandals, the legal trouble come in. A whole new chapter of her life.
Polly's story, it really makes you think about American history at the time.
Yeah.
All those contradictions,
Yeah, the Roaring Twenties, all that excitement, the culture changing so fast, but also this pushback against anything seen as, well, immoral. People were anxious about all the changes, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that tension, you can see it play out in Polly's life. She wasn't exactly invisible to those judging eyes, especially when you get to the Seabury Commission investigations in the early 30s. They were all about exposing corruption in New York's government.
Big scandal stuff.
Exactly. And while Polly wasn't the main target, you can't separate her business from those powerful figures. She got caught up in the whole mess.
Makes you realize how risky her position was, not just running the business, but navigating those legal and political waters. And they weren't so clear-cut back then, were they?
Not at all. And think about the hypocrisy, right? Like in the spring of 35, she gets convicted, but not for prostitution, for having objectionable films.
Sounds like a bit of a convenient excuse to target her, don't you think? I mean, she was operating in this gray area, legally and socially.
Totally. It really shows you how the law, even when it seemed clear, could be used against certain people, the undesirables or those without the resources to fight back.
And that wasn't the end of her legal troubles either. 1943, she even ends up in prison. Her 17th charge related to prostitution. But then the case gets dismissed. Was that her lawyers being clever? Or did those powerful connections come in handy?
Tough to say for sure without digging deeper into, well, court records, accounts from the time. But it's not hard to believe her influence helped her navigate the system better than, say, someone with less clout. Justice wasn't always blind, especially in New York. Too many layers of power.
It paints this picture of Polly as, well, a real operator, handling the business side, the legal pressures. But was there more to her than just that? One quote that stood out to me, it's from Milton Berle, the entertainer. He knew Polly and described her as intelligent woman, fun to be with, and a good cook. Hints at a different side, right?
It's a peek behind the curtain, isn't it? The woman beyond the madam image. How did she manage those different parts of her life? Did she have real friendships outside of that world? How do you reconcile those two sides of yourself?
So many questions. And a good place to start exploring them is her autobiography, A House is Not a Home. Published in '53, became a huge hit, over 2 million copies sold, even a movie based on it.
Wow, that's quite the impact.
What do you think motivated her to write it? Was it a tell-all, spilling secrets about those high-profile clients?
Yeah.
Or something more personal, trying to control how people saw her?
Think about the time period, too, the 50s, Cold War anxieties, conservative values making a comeback. Was she cashing in on the public's fascination with, well, vice? Or trying to make sense of her life in a world that was becoming less tolerant?
Whatever the reason, the book's success shows Polly knew how to hold people's attention. She understood storytelling. Maybe she saw this as a chance to show herself as more than just a madam. A woman who broke the rules, made her own way, even if it was controversial.
That's a really interesting take, and it raises another question, doesn't it? Was she a product of her times, shaped by those unique circumstances? Or was there something more, well, timeless about her drive, her ambition, in a world that tried to hold women back?
That's a great point. And then another big turn in her story. 1945, she decides to retire from her, well, let's call it entrepreneurial career.
And she doesn't just fade away either. This woman never finished high school, goes back, gets her diploma, then an associate degree from Los Angeles City College.
That's incredible. Talk about resilience. It challenges that whole idea that, well, someone in her line of work wouldn't have intellectual curiosity, you know?
Almost like she's rejecting the label society gave her, pushing herself, learning, showing she's more than just the madam.
But was it all about personal growth? Or maybe also a way to change her public image, gain some respectability in a society that had, well, often judged her harshly?
It could be both, couldn't it? We're all complicated, made up of different parts. Even those who live in the shadows can have hopes, dreams for something more.
Absolutely. And that's what makes exploring these stories so important. They remind us that people aren't just one thing, even those who make choices we might not agree with.
It's about understanding the nuances, the gray areas, and honestly, that's how we understand human nature better, right? The push and pull between what society expects and what we want for ourselves.
So, as we get towards the end of Polly's story, I'm struck by, well, just how much her life covered, from poverty, trauma, to building this controversial empire, and then seeking some kind of, I don't know, redemption through education, writing. It's like a mini history of America itself, all those changes happening around her. You know, looking back at Polly's story, it really makes you think about how things would be different today. I mean, she navigated this very specific world back then, but would someone like Polly Adler even be possible now?
That's a question, isn't it? The world's changed so much, even just thinking about the internet, social media, the whole legal and social landscape around sex work is completely different.
Right. Back then, part of her success was those limited options for women, that whole underground scene during Prohibition. Things have shifted so much.
Imagine how someone would gain that kind of notoriety in the 21st century. Would it even be the same path?
It makes you wonder. I mean, Paula was a master of publicity, but that was a different time. Imagine her with Twitter going viral.
Haha. Notorious Madam becomes influencer.
Exactly. But jokes aside, it's fascinating how ambition, entrepreneurship, they take different forms in different eras. But that drive to stand out, to make an impact, even if it means breaking the rules, that seems pretty constant.
It's human nature, right? And that's what makes studying someone like Paul Adler so interesting. It's not just the juicy details. It's about understanding the bigger picture, how people navigate the world around them.
And I think that's a big takeaway for anyone listening. Agree with her choices or not, Polly's story shows us that history is full of these complicated people. You can't just put them in a box, label them good or bad.
It's a reminder to look deeper, understand the context. Every historical figure, every person really, has these nuances that make them unique.
So wrapping up our deep dive into Polly Adler's world, I'm left with this feeling of, well, respect for how she adapted, overcame challenges, and ultimately wrote her own story, literally and figuratively.
And for me, it's that reminder about the power of individual stories. They shed light on bigger historical trends and honestly make us question what we think we know about the past.
Absolutely. If anyone's intrigued by Polly Adler, definitely check out her autobiography, A House is Not a Home. It's her first-hand account and really gives you a look into that whole era of New York City.
A fascinating read, trust me. You'll learn a lot about Polly, the time she lived in, and maybe even yourself.
That's what we hope for with these deep dives, to spark some curiosity, encourage you to explore, to learn more.
Keep diving, keep asking questions, keep searching for those stories that make history so captivating.
Until next time, happy exploring.